Good afternoon, good morning to you all. Welcome back to BoF Live. Today, in a special BoF Careers focus session, we're going to be discussing how fashion companies can effectively engage and leverage emerging talent. And we're going to share some insights into how best emerging talent can take advantage of a new dynamic that's emerging between emerging talent and employers in the fashion, luxury, and beauty industries. Today, Generation Z are born approximately between 1997 and 2012. Account for around 20% of the global population, but they account for more than 40% of fashion's customer base. Their beliefs and values are shaping modern consumer behavior, resulting in greater demand for transparency around operations, a growing expectation that brands reflect their social values and deliver experiences as successfully online as they do offline. As a result, understanding and authentically representing the expectations of younger consumers is crucial to drive business performance. And this is really prompting fashion companies to really focus on hiring emerging talent and how they use that emerging talent once they're through the doors. However, attracting and leveraging young talent has become much more challenging due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has prompted global hiring freezes and disrupted education systems worldwide. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by two of the contributors to the latest BoF Careers white paper on crafting an emerging talent strategy. Jennifer Jordan, a professor of leadership and organisational behaviour at IMD. She writes for the likes of Harvard Business Review and Business Ethics Quarterly and Journal of Applied Social Psychology, and she received her doctoral degree and 2 masters from Yale University. Jennifer, thank you so much for coming today.
My pleasure.
I'm also thrilled to be joined by LaVergne, who is the Chief Diversity Officer and Senior Vice President of Global Talent Acquisition at PVH, which is the owner of Tommy Hilfiger and Calvin Klein. My apologies. Lance, thank you for joining us today.
It's good to be here.
Just to kick straight in then, really, Lance, perhaps we can start with you. From an industry perspective, how have you seen the awareness of the importance of emerging talent, Gen Z talent, grow over the last few years, or have you seen it grow?
We absolutely have seen the growth of the appreciation and awareness of the importance of this segment in our industry. I think it's no secret that early talent really drives trends, and fashion is no exception to that. And so as our industry looks to continue to evolve and attract new talent segments, new consumer segments, this portion of our population is critical to our industry.
Beyond young talent's ability to represent youth trends and to really identify where things are moving on a product basis, are there any values that this younger generation of talent have come to be associated with, or perhaps traits that they are bringing to the workplace that are particularly relevant? I don't know, Jennifer, if you have any thoughts, or Lance, if you wanted to share yours. Jennifer, why don't you jump in?
Okay, all right. So when we think about, so thanks. So then maybe Lance can join after that. And I think for me, it's so interesting that we're in this forum on talent, because especially at IMD, we work with many different industries. And what's interesting, like every industry we work with knows that obviously they need to retain top talent. From millennials, it was first millennials, and now they're becoming more attuned to Generation Z. But what's interesting is, like many of these industries, it's not the Generation Zers that are driving trends in the industry. So for example, like I work with a company that makes elevators. I don't think Generation Z are driving, how you construct an elevator or making the little screws that go into watches. But within fashion, right, you're not only needing to retain them because they're the minds of the future, they're going to be the CEOs of the future, but because also they're the ones driving the trend. So I think really focusing on what they need and what their preferences are is front and center and really important. And in my research, this was true for millennials, and I think it is even more so for Generation Z. And I don't know the data if this was accelerated because of COVID, but this idea that life and career is about pursuing one's own goals and one's own, not only career goals, but also life goals. And it's not about working for the same company for someone's whole life, but really having a very diverse career that gives you different perspectives and gives you different experience that ultimately feed your own personal goals. And that's, if we look across the generations, that's one of the biggest changes that we see. And also, I think, we talk about the hippie generation as being very socially minded. In a way, we're seeing a resurgence of that with Black Lives Matter and with the Me Too movement, et cetera. And so I think there's also this new perspective, and certainly more than any generation before, understanding issues around gender. I don't think, at least when I was growing up, those issues were not discussed. And so I often look to my Gen Z colleagues, which we have at IMD, or my Gen Z friends, friends of, children of friends, to inform me on this. And I think it's really important to have those people in organizations as well. And then I'll turn over to Lance. I'm sure you have a perspective on that, given your role.
No, that's exactly right. And I think one of the things that we are seeing from this generation is a social consciousness that is really critical and important to them. And I think the way that they will hold companies accountable for not only their corporate perspective, the business side of things, but the social and engagement side of things as well. And any organization that wants to be relevant and viable in the future will have to understand that the intersections between the corporate and the social have become so intertwined that you can't separate them anymore. And I think that's a really important dynamic that this generation in particular is making very central to how businesses think and operate. I think you touched on it as well, but inclusion and diversity are really important to this group as well. Some of the research, I can't remember exactly where I saw this, but as you go through the different stages of generation, the importance of inclusion and diversity increases as you get younger in that framework and structure. And so the fact that Gen Z and millennials really put a high value on inclusion and diversity, from my perspective as the Chief Diversity Officer of PVH, is a wonderful thing to see. Because that's what will probably lead to greater and prolonged and systemic change that we've been looking to see in a lot of our industries. So very excited about that aspect of what this generation is bringing.
Just before we move on to some of the forums where emerging talent and younger talent might have an opportunity to really, input into businesses and hold them accountable, as you say, and how best talent can navigate them, and equally how best organizations can create those forums. One other aspect of this generation is obviously digital fluency. And, we are living in an increasing, we are all entering the metaverse. It's almost like our digital world is over and the metaverse has been born. But Lance, I wondered if there's anything you could share about how relevant that is to this generation's success and critical nature to success in the industry.
Oh, I was going to mention that, so I'm glad you brought it up. Digital is key. And we've seen that certainly in our business in particular. We certainly have our whole array of physical stores, but throughout the pandemic, in-person retail was really not as much of an option. And so all of us have had to really double down on digital, whether it's through marketing, e-commerce, you name it, communication, marketing. That has really been proven to be the way of the future. And the fluency of this generation is critical to that and will continue to drive digital as an important element of all of our businesses.
Jennifer, you wrote about a concept called shadow boards a number of years ago now, and it's a focus of one of the focuses of your research. And shadow boards, at which I will allow you to explain in further detail in a second, but or will ask you to rather, my apologies, are really an opportunity for younger consumers to be something of a check and a balance. And, as Lance is saying, the future is digital, authentic representation of communities, the importance of inclusivity. There is a number of very important elements of businesses as they become digital, where that young opinion, that young check and balance is increasingly important. Could you perhaps share the evolution of the shadow board and how you've seen it evolve from when it first came to the scene? I believe in fashion, the most famous early adopter was Gucci a number of years ago, but perhaps you could share.
Well, it started before that. So, there were even experiments, for example, in GE long before that with shadow board, but it really has only taken on a speed in the last, I would say, 3 to 5 years. And now I wrote this article that in 2019, which was sort of the first iteration of shadow boards, the first article to come out on it, actually. And every week, no question, I get at least 2 emails from companies saying, this is a great idea, we want to run it. And I would frame it a bit differently. than you do, Robin. And I should probably explain what a shadow board is. So it's essentially a board that shadows the executive team. And this can be the supervisory board that they shadow. So for example, the board of directors, but it more commonly is the executive board that they shadow. And normally they are an actual number shadow. So if there's 8 people on the executive team, there's 8 people on the shadow board, et cetera. But what I would say is different is that they're not just acting as a check and balance, as you said, Robin, but really driving some of these initiatives within companies. So they're not just making sure that what the board decides on or initiates the initiatives that they put forward, that they're relevant for their generation, but also bringing things to the table that maybe because of blind spots with the older generations, would not be discussed or would not be brought to the table. So sometimes they're the front runners rather than just the checks and balances. And where I think shadow boards have changed, because we're now in the second phase of our research, is by looking at the first phase was really done to retain millennial talent. That's why companies had shadow boards back in 2017, 2018. They were losing millennial talent. They thought, okay, this is a way to keep them because we get to hear their voice, which we knew was important for millennials. They get to feel recognized in the company. They get to meet key members and their talent gets recognized. What we're seeing now, Robin, in the last year or 18 months is that shadow boards really are, and this would be interesting to Lance, sort of experiments or microcosms of diversity with an organization. So let's say you have an organization that tends to be more geographically dominant in Europe. Sometimes shadow boards will actually be not about millennials or about a certain age group, but shadow boards will be about a certain region. So we're going to have everyone on that shadow board who's not from Europe, or we're going to have everyone on that shadow board. I've even seen LGBT shadow boards. So we're going to have people on that shadow board that are from unrepresented sexual orientations in our organization and inform us on these issues and take a front seat. So what I've seen shadow board, or where I've seen shadow boards really evolve, is going from a way to retain millennials to a way of getting diverse voices at the table. And they're no longer limited by age. I've seen people on shadow boards that are in their 40s, but they represent a certain perspective that is not normally represented in the company or especially on the executive team.
Lance, did you want to respond? Perfect.
Absolutely. I love the idea and the concept, certainly from the perspective of, for 2 reasons. One, in an organization where there is progression and tenure and all of those things that are often impediments for early talent, it is a way to accelerate their integration into the organization, give them visibility and interaction that can then accelerate their development and advancement. So that's a wonderful aspect of a shadow board if you can implement it and operate it effectively in your organization. And the other thing that Jennifer mentioned is something that is of interest to us as an organization at PVH as well, is the ability to bring in different voices, particularly when they are not represented in the workforce demographic of the teams or groups that are making decisions about things. Again, you have the constraints of promotion, advancement, and development and recruiting that can sometimes take time to generate the kind of diversity that you'd like to see in your organization. This is a great way to infuse that as you're also working on those other HR processes to bring about greater diversity. Love the idea and the concept.
Jennifer, what are the sort of best principles to found a shadow board on? You know, how can companies that are interested in doing it try and do so in a way that's most likely to engender success?
Yeah, well, I think the first and foremost, and this is probably not a surprise to anyone in the audience, is that it has to be championed by the CEO, or at least by a couple members of the executive team. Because if the CEO is not on board, if members of the executive team themselves are not really bought into this, it doesn't work, because you actually have to allow the shadow board to have insight into the decisions of the executive team. And if you're resistant, or if the executive team is resistant to this, or they do it just as a superficial sort of to show that they're open, but they're not really, it never really works. The other thing that has to be in place is or it doesn't have to be, but I would strongly recommend not just picking your identified top talent to be members of this shadow board. Because what I found, and this was really interesting in one case in particular, was that the company had this talent pool and they allowed certain members from that talent pool, or they picked certain members to be on the board, but the other 50% of the seats on the shadow board, they opened up to open applications. So you could apply to be on the board. They then sent everyone who was shortlisted to an assessment center. And what they found, to their surprise, was that the people that were not on the talent pool list actually outperformed those who were in the assessment center. And what it shows, I think, and Lance, I see you smiling, is that I think we tend to pick, and we know this in organizations, that talent tend to be people that look just like us and act like us and come from the same backgrounds. And when you give that opportunity to people that might not be classically seen as talent, you might even get a better shadow board and a more rich shadow board to work with the executive team. And then the last thing I would say is, don't assume that the executive team knows how to interact with the shadow board and the shadow board knows how to interact with the executive team. Doing trainings around communication, ways that they can better work together, understand how they communicate. So for example, if it is Gen Zers and people that are baby boomers or late Gen Xers, there are different ways that they communicate. So sharing these different methods, how does the executive team like things presented to them? How does the Gen Zers like things to get presented to them? Can be really helpful and can facilitate the dialogue and the exchange.
Yeah, I was smiling, Jennifer, because I'm not surprised by the outcomes that you discussed, with the differences in the performance, because what caught my eye, caught my ear, is that you said they put people through an assessment. And oftentimes we make talent decisions that are very subjective in nature. But when you use an assessment, you've established what the objective criteria are for success in a particular thing, and you apply those criteria to everybody, presumably equally. And then the most qualified or able people should emerge from that process. And as your example cites, sometimes it's not who you thought it was. But that's why, from a diversity and inclusion perspective, trying to get to as objective an approach as possible is really critical, because then you do eliminate a lot of the bias that shows up in our decision making and our processes. So that is a wonderful example and very instructive for anybody who's trying to put some of these things in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, as you said, it's normally, at least in organizations I work with, the talent pool is made up of people who are nominated by their superiors, their managers. And we know that managers tend to recognize talent as people that reminds them of them when they were that age. And that tends to also be people that have the same educational background, the same geographic background, the same ethnic background, the same sexual orientation probably as well. I don't know the data on that as much, but you can see that there is this, by opening it up and allowing it to people, to all people to apply, you're going to find talent in the organization that probably wasn't classically labeled as talent.
One of the other sort of revolutions that are going on with the new talent entering the workforce is a shift in management style. I entered the workforce when I think we were sort of dealing with command style management, but done in a certain way with a certain level of sort of respect was being expected in the workforce, and that was more conscious. But today it really does seem managers are there to sort of harness the talent of their juniors, and it's much more coach based. That's a challenge in itself to shift that management culture. But Lance, I know that there's a lot of mentorship, and there are groups like ERGs and BNGs at PVH. And I wondered if you could share some of the work you've done in such a huge organization to help individuals both managing and being managed to really benefit from each other.
Yeah, the point you raise is really key, because the traditional styles of management and work have been shifting. Some of it is based on the digital orientation that we've talked about with some of early talent, and just the way they process information. The traditional sense of work on it until it's perfect and don't present it till it's ready. That's out the window. It is now much more iterative, just in time. Let's adjust and adapt as we go along and get to a better solution and outcome. And that can be challenging for some managers and leaders. But it also can be challenging for the talent that likes to operate that way and finds those constraints in the organization. So it's really important for organizations and folks like PVH to help both groups of talent, managers and talent, understand those different dynamics and build the skill sets and capabilities to adapt to each other's styles. And so we have those training sessions available. We have manager effectiveness trainings, but it's also important, I think, as you pointed out, to help mentor and coach emerging talent to understand how to adapt and adjust themselves to the environment and to leverage their approach to help drive some change as well. And that's where your BRGs and your mentoring programs can really come into play and be very helpful in that regard.
Have either of you any experience in reverse mentorship, which is a similar concept to shadow boards, but on a one-to-one basis or a smaller scale? And I wondered if there was any insight you could share around reverse mentorship. Lance, would you like to go first?
I absolutely love the idea of reverse mentorship, and hopefully my video is good here. It is a concept that I was introduced to a number of years ago, back when early on in my I&D journey in financial services. And back then it was about generational difference and the idea of pairing up more senior executives with emerging talent so that those more senior people could get a better understanding and sense for that perspective. Since then, reverse mentoring has been used across a whole variety of dimensions of difference. And it's really a way for people who may be fairly narrow in their focus to understand a broader set of perspectives that really allow them to be more effective in their roles. And a reverse mentoring relationship should create a safe space for those two parties to engage in those discussions and dialogue. Because when you're a senior person, you sometimes operate under this notion that you're supposed to know how these things go, and you don't want to be vulnerable or show any weakness about anything, particularly around these type of topics. And so if I can pair you up with somebody where you can ask those questions and make the missteps and educate yourself on a different perspective that you don't normally get, the benefit is tremendous. And so reverse mentoring programs, when done effectively, add a lot of value to an organization.
Great points. And I think we also actually wrote a paper on reverse mentoring, which came out shortly after the shadow board. And what we found, and this is picking up exactly what Lance said, is that when done correctly, just like with the shadow board, when you don't have it structured in certain ways, the momentum can often dwindle. So one of the most important factors we found for sustaining good reverse mentorship relationships was the priority that the executives put on these relationships. So what we found is that if a leader or the mentee, the one who was more senior but being mentored, if they canceled more than 2 appointments consecutively, the relationships just fell apart. And within 6 months, there was no mentorship going on anymore. And so what's really important is that, again, kind of the tone from the top is there, that the executives are really invested in it, what they see being helpful for them, but also to create a community for the mentors, often the ones that are younger or lower down the hierarchy, where they can share best practices, where they can share learnings, and they can share ways of communicating with their mentees. So those were the 2 factors that we found really important. One was emphasizing it as a priority and really making it a priority for the executives in their busy schedules. And then number 2, creating a community for the mentors.
As we enter the final third of the conversation, we're going to sort of shift tact a little bit and talk about the emerging talents perspective, how they can enter these forums that we've been describing, and some tips for them. But just before we do that, I wondered if either of you, if both of you could share, what are some of the benefits that organizations can expect if they get these things right? If you can create reverse mentorships, which with mentees that are accountable, if you can make shadow boards that have, synchronized communication styles with the board that they're shadowing, what are the kind of things that companies can expect to come out of that? Lance, would you like to go first?
Sure. It sounds trite to say it, but the thing that differentiates an organization from its competitors is its talent. At the end of the day, that's what makes the difference. And so what we're talking about here are effective strategies to manage talent and create opportunities for that talent to be as effective as possible in those organizations. Emerging talent, and if you're an organization that is really good at cultivating and building and developing your talent, is an absolute key to success and a competitive advantage in any industry. And I think in the fashion industry in particular, given some of the things that we've discussed.
There's not much I can add to what Lance said in terms of the upsides, right? At the end of the day, it is about talent, and it is about creativity and mindset and perspectives. But I'll just also add, it's not only about what you can gain or what you can, how you can profit or benefit, but also how you can avoid certain missteps. And I think this has been very true in fashion, right? Like certain campaigns, you're like, how did that ever go out? Or how did you ever produce that product? And I think if there were people who were making decisions that were from some different communities, they probably would have never gone out. So I think it's also not only about how can you benefit, but how can you avoid real missteps? Yeah.
Jennifer, that actually segues, I think, quite naturally into some of the missteps that younger, less experienced talent can also make in the workplace. You know, we are talking about, quite rightly, very emotional subject matters with some of the failures of the industry in terms of the campaigns and the products that you mentioned or that we're referring to. Similarly, you know, there are legacy organizations that are not keeping up with the pace of the world and it's the changes in terms of how people want things to be run today. And that's quite difficult, I think, for individuals with less professional experience than they will have in the future to understand that organizations can't change on a dime, especially when there is often, you know, we've grown up, well, in recent years, there's been this sort of cult of the disruptive entrepreneur where you can change everything suddenly and things should be broken to be better, et cetera, et cetera. Do either of you have any advice you'd like to share just in terms of how emerging talent should consider the best way they can be most effective in creating the change they would like to see in the organizations they have joined in a way that is effective more than anything else?
Maybe I can start. I would say two things that are certainly not new concepts. So the first one is communication. So I think how you communicate. A great book that I'm reading now is called Nonviolent Communication, and it sounds like a strange title, but it's essentially how do you communicate with more compassion. And I would then say the second topic, not only communication, but is compassion. I think when you're coming from a different perspective, especially if it's a minority perspective, you tend to assume negative intent from the majority group sometimes. Like they just don't care about me or they're not interested. And sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes it really is a matter of education. And so how can you educate through communication? How can you educate and how can you inform? Because most of the executives I work with at IMD, where I'm a professor, have really good intent and they want to make a difference and they want to connect better with different groups and different generations, but many of them just don't know how. And so I think by approaching it with how do I communicate in a nonviolent way, meaning a way that shows compassion and shows understanding from where they're coming from, I think that can make huge headway. Simple concepts, but very, very meaningful.
Yeah, Robin, the other thing that I would advise anyone who is coming in and trying to be a change agent or a disruptor, particularly in an organization or a situation that is reasonably well established, is to acknowledge what has preceded you before you just go in and try and advise or try to engineer wholesale change. And it's kind of just a generally good principle from a change perspective, because I have seen things fail miserably simply because the person who was trying to advocate for change didn't say, you know, what was here? There's some really good stuff here, but here's how we can make it better or do it differently. Because sometimes the people who are decision makers can be huge barriers to change and roadblocks if they don't feel that they were at least acknowledged for what they had brought, what they brought to the table. And so a piece of advice I'd give to anybody, especially young talent, is before you come in guns a-blazing, make sure you kind of read the room and understand the situation and figure out the best ways to advocate for the change that you think the organization or the situation warrants.
That's great advice. And I think no one, no matter what group you're from, wants to feel threatened, right? And when you come in and just say, oh, out with the old, in with the new, that can really feel quite threatening. And I think it goes back a little bit to that compassion for the other side. So really good point, Lance.
How does that dynamic of sort of not threatening the incumbent professionals play out when it comes to working styles in your experience? You know, Gen Z want to work in a different way. They are very entrepreneurial. They've managed, or they are not dependent upon the traditional gatekeepers in our industry as previous generations of talent have been. You know, they have peers that have been extremely successful without going through those gates. So is there anything you'd like to share just in terms of working styles, Jennifer?
Yeah. What I'm going to say might seem a bit abstract, but I think it can be quite helpful. Is I talked about communication earlier. Part of communication is not only what you say, what comes out of your mouth, or even what you do non-verbally, but just listening. And oftentimes when people feel uncomfortable with new working style, like what, you're going to work from home, or you want to go to Brazil for a month and work from there, they're feeling there's a reason why they're reacting like that. Maybe they feel like, do you not want to be close to me? Or do you not think, this beautiful office we have is useful? Or do you, can I not micromanage you when you're down there? So there's some emotional reaction to when a new idea is proposed, and really starting to understand, listen to, why would you not like me to work from home? What are you worried about? Or, what maybe, what do you think I would lose if I worked from home or work somewhere else or work different hours, whatever it might be. And I think when you can listen or ask questions even to the other side and understand what is really the root of that anxiety or the root of the resistance, you can start to work with that and say, oh, okay, you're afraid or you're worried that if I work from home or I work at different hours, that I'm not going to be able to collaborate with the team at the same level. How might we then ensure that I can collaborate even if I'm not in the office? So you can really get to the root of what the issue is, not just fight over, do I work at home or do I work at the office, right? So listen and ask questions can go a long way.
Yeah, I was going to say, Jennifer said it. It's about communication. And as she also put it, and I've been experiencing this with some of the folks on my team, you have to be clear on what are the objectives or the outcomes that you're hoping to see. So that's the what of the work, and it's the how that becomes the issue, and that's negotiable. But as long as you're both clear on the deliverables, you can negotiate how we get there. But it's the ability to have that dialogue and that conversation with your manager that's really important. And as controversial as this might seem, you should, if you find yourself in situations where that isn't available to you, you have options. And so I think organizations have to understand that and be willing to accommodate that and be clear and flexible if the organizations are truly interested in acquiring, developing, nurturing, and retaining talent.
One other element that we've been discussing today about the advantages of opening up these channels of information from young talent and really allowing them to input values and skills and all those things. But there's also, in my experience, not personally, but in our experience in researching, there's also a risk that young talent, especially if they are representative of traditionally underrepresented communities in shadow boards or a variety of other different forums, are looked to solve the issues of an organization, or that a lot of unofficial or official work is created for young talent, and that there isn't the appropriate dynamic between the employer and the employees. I wondered if there's any advice or insight you could share on the reticence that some companies should employ when they are looking at this young talent, and how they can really benefit from the ideas and the values they bring, but not do so in a way that is going to potentially encourage leading emerging talent to consider what their options are and to think about other places where they're not being given the lion's share of responsibility to solve what are complex operational legacy issues at times. Jennifer, perhaps you could share your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I haven't experienced it so much in my work with shadow boards that they're being relied on to carry out these initiatives, or that undue weight or undue responsibility is put on them. I haven't seen that so much. What I've seen more is what you said earlier, which is kind of the unofficial work. And we know that certain unrepresented communities or unrepresented groups in an organization are often given tasks that are not recognized. And therefore, when it comes to promotion, they're not necessarily seen as the one that did that great project last year, because they were doing a great project, but it wasn't one that was official and it wasn't one that was recognized. So I would say more, ensuring that the work they do is recognized and that is given the due respect and the due visibility in the organization that it deserves, because I think otherwise then we're going to just continue to promote people that are from the minority groups in organizations.
Yeah, Jennifer captured that really well. And I've seen this, not necessarily here at PVH, but certainly in other organizations where I've worked. And it is particularly acute with folks who are part of the employee resource groups or business resource groups, because that is extra work that people are doing. And I've been part of organizations where we have recognized that these folks who are leading these teams learn to influence without authority. They learn how to project manage. They learn how to get stuff done and manage budgets outside of their traditional day jobs. And what has been really wonderful to see in some of the companies where I've been is that we've incorporated those experiences as part of the evaluation, that those individuals could include those in their performance review and their self-assessments, that we acknowledge those leadership skills as satisfying the criteria in job descriptions as people were considering internal mobility. So if an organization can get to the point where they do recognize and reward those extracurricular activities that are often asked of underrepresented communities, that makes it a much more valuable exercise, both for the individuals and the organization as well.
I'm sad to say that we're getting very close to running out of time, but just as a sort of final question to wrap up with some optimism and hope, I hope, we do seem to be at, the beginning of a new age, as it were, and that, the age of hierarchy, the time it takes in order for ideas to be shared around an organization, that a good idea can come from anywhere, does seem to be much more likely today. What is it, and Jennifer, I'll start with you, but what is it that excites you about the opportunities for emerging talent and businesses today to be working in a much more rational, much more exciting and dynamic way than they have done in previous years? Or Lance, if you would like to go first, please do feel free.
Well, the excitement level is high. I mean, the energy, the innovation, just the general perspective that comes from emerging talents, new generations coming into the workforce is fantastic. And we have already seen the historical evidence of the impact that new emerging talent brings into any industry or organization. And again, we talked about the ability or the opportunity to be more competitive in your industry, in your business, is really driven by your ability to engage and harness that talent, that innovation, that energy. And I just am very excited to see what transpires with this new Gen Z generation that comes into our workforce.
Yeah, I think what excites me is, and it's maybe putting the positive spin or the silver lining to the gray cloud, is that I've certainly noticed in many organizations, because of COVID, they've accelerated in how they communicate and how they think about work more in a 3-month period of time than they did in 3 years previous to that, maybe even more. And so I think what excites me is, because they had to, people gave things a try during COVID or during the last year and a few months, 16 months or so. And so you saw people, what do they say? Necessity is the mother of innovation or invention. And you saw that. And that makes me really excited. And at the same time, I'm wondering where we're going to land on this, because as a psychologist, I've definitely seen that virtual work still misses something, no matter how good our screens are, how great our speakers are, or what have you. there's still something that's missed. And so I'm not an advocate of people working 100% remotely. I think there needs to be some kind of hybrid. There's nothing that replaces a night out with your colleagues or, time sitting at the table together and just exchanging ideas. We haven't gotten to a good way to do that virtually, or as good of a way to do that virtually. And there's a lot of evidence of that. So I think what excites me is two things, is to sum it up. One is what we're capable of and capable of quickly, and also the possibility of where we're going to land after all of this passes, which I hope it will soon.
Lance, just by way of conclusion, is there any advice you would share for talent cohorts that are entering the industry digitally, that are connecting with you and your teams and their managers and their bosses for the first time over Zoom, potentially, that may not meet their colleagues for a number of months? Is there anything that you've seen work very well at PVH? And Jennifer, please do follow if there's anything you'd like to add. I just didn't want to put it at your door unfairly.
Well, as someone who has onboarded into an organization virtually, I joined PVH in the middle of the pandemic. I have been living this experience. And what I would say is that being comfortable with the virtual engagement is really important. And one of the things that has been interesting here at PVH is that, I think, Jennifer, one of the things that you miss from not being in person is kind of the drop in, the ability, to see people in the hallway or in the pantry or whatever. And I've started to notice, even here internally, that my computer will ring and someone will just call me on our Jabber is our internal platform that we use. Someone will just literally pick up the phone and call me, just like they would have done if I were sitting in my office and they popped in to ask a question. And I love it. Just like, oh, this is so nice. Hello. And we have that exchange that so we're not being constrained to the stricture of the calendar to interact, but we're being more informal. And I've loved that. And it may be just me, but the fact that it is happening more regularly, I think, lets me know that people are trying to bring some of that informal connection to what has been much more formal video Zoom type stuff.
That's really great to hear, because I would have said one of the things we lose most is spontaneity. And at least with most of the organizations I've worked with before COVID, they were all like, oh, we have to become less siloed. We're such siloed organizations. We don't interact cross-functionally, et cetera. And COVID just accelerated that siloed way of working, right? You only worked or only communicated with the people that were directly involved in your tasks or in your projects. And so I'm hearing now from Lance that people maybe are breaking out of this and starting to try to find ways of simulating that coffee machine banter you might have, or running into someone in the hall is great. But I think that's something that we're still having to work on and learn how to do. I would also say that we shouldn't neglect the importance of that care and compassion right now. And I hear this from more and more organizations, is that people during the pandemic, we're feeling lonely, we're feeling disconnected. And I'm not sure, to me, it mirrors a lot the transformation in education a couple of decades ago, where teachers were now just not teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic, but having to care for some of the social well-being of their students. I see the same thing happening in organizations. It's now not only our job to be respectful to our employees, to give a good salary that's fair, to onboard in good ways, but also we really need to care for their well-being. And I'm not sure what that right balance is, because I don't think it's fully the responsibility of an organization to show that care, but I think it's absolutely necessary on the other hand. So yeah, I think that's going to be also one of the challenges going forward, of what really is the role of the organization in caring for their employees. Where does it start and where does it stop?
Fascinating stuff. Thank you both so much for your time. I know our community, both here on BoF Live and on YouTube, appreciate it very much. There are no questions that have come through that are specifically relevant to this conversation. So thank you both so much for your time, and we'll call it a day there. So Lance, thank you. Jennifer, thank you. Goodbye and have a wonderful day.
Pleasure.